The Expedition of Humphry Clinker. By Tobias Smollett. To Sir Watkin Phillips, Bart. At Oxon. Dear Wat, every day is now big with incident and discovery. Young Mr. Denison proves to be no other than that identical person whom I have execrated so long, under the name of Wilson. He had eloped from college at Cambridge, to avoid a match that he detested, and acted in different parts of the country as a stroller, until the lady in question made choice of a husband for herself. Then he returned to his father, and disclosed his passion for Liddy, which met with the approbation of his parents, though the father little imagined that Mr. Bramble was his old companion Matthew Lloyd. The young gentleman, being empowered to make honourable proposals to my uncle and me, had been in search of us all over England, without effect, and he it was whom I had seen pass on horseback by the window of the inn, where I stood with my sister, but he little dreamed that we were in the house. As for the real Mr. Wilson, whom I called forth to combat, by mistake, he is the neighbour and intimate friend of old Mr. Denison, and this connection had suggested to the son the idea of taking that name while he remained in obscurity. You may easily conceive what pleasure I must have felt on discovering that the honour of our family was in no danger from the conduct of a sister whom I love with uncommon affection, that, instead of debasing her sentiments and views to a wretched stroller, she had really captivated the heart of a gentleman, her equal in rank and superior in fortune, and that, as his parents approved of his attachment, I was on the eve of acquiring a brother-in-law so worthy of my friendship and esteem. George Denison is, without all question, one of the most accomplished young fellows in England. His person is at once elegant and manly, and his understanding highly cultivated. Though his spirit is lofty, his heart is kind, and his manner so engaging, as to command veneration and love, even from malice and indifference. When I weigh my own character with his, I am ashamed to find myself so light in the balance, but the comparison excites no envy. I propose him as a model for imitation. I have endeavored to recommend myself to his friendship, and hope I have already found a place in his affection. I am, however, mortified to reflect what flagrant injustice we every day commit, and what absurd judgment we form, in viewing objects, through the falsifying mediums of prejudice and passion. Had you asked me a few days ago, the picture of Wilson the player, I should have drawn a portrait very unlike the real person and character of George Denison. Without all doubt, the greatest advantage acquired in travelling and perusing mankind in the original, is that of dispelling those shameful clouds that darken the faculties of the mind, preventing it from judging with candour and precision. The real Wilson is a great original, and the best-tempered, companionable man I ever knew. I question if ever he was angry or low-spirited in his life. He makes no pretensions to letters, but he is an adept in everything else that can be either useful or entertaining. Among other qualifications, he is a complete sportsman, and counted the best shot in the county. He and Denison, and Lismahago and I, attended by Clinker, went a-shooting yesterday, and made a great havoc among the partridges. Tomorrow we shall take the field against the woodcocks and snipes. In the evening we dance and sing, or play at commerce, loo, and quadrille. Mr. Denison is an elegant poet, and has written some detached pieces on the subject of his passion for Liddy, which must be very flattering to the vanity of a young woman. Perhaps he is one of the greatest theatrical geniuses that ever appeared. He sometimes entertains us with reciting favourite speeches from our best plays. We are resolved to convert the great hall into a theatre, and get up the beau stratagem without delay. I think I shall make no contemptible figure in the character of Scrub, and Lismahago will be very great in Captain Gibbet. Wilson undertakes to entertain the country people with Harlequin skeleton, for which he has got a jacket ready painted with his own hand. Our society is really enchanting. Even the severity of Lismahago relaxes, and the vinegar of Mrs. Tabby is remarkably dulcified, ever since it was agreed that she should take precedency of her niece in being first noosed, for, you must know, the day is fixed for Liddy's marriage, and the banns for both couples have been already once published in the parish church. The captain earnestly begged that one trouble might serve for all, and Tabitha assented with a vile affectation of reluctance. Her inamorado, who came hither very slenderly equipped, has sent for his baggage to London, which, in all probability, will not arrive in time for the wedding, but it is of no great consequence, as everything is to be transacted with the utmost privacy. Meanwhile, directions are given for making out the contracts of marriage, which are very favourable for both females. Liddy will be secured in a good jointure, and her aunt will remain mistress of her own fortune, except one half of the interest, which her husband shall have a right to enjoy for his natural life. I think this is as little in conscience as can be done for a man who yokes with such a partner for life. These expectants seem to be so happy, that if Mr. Denison had an agreeable daughter, I believe I should be for making the third couple in this country dance. The humour seems to be infectious, for Clinker, alias Lloyd, has a month's mind to play the fool, in the same fashion, with Mrs. Winifred Jenkins. He has even sounded me on the subject, but I have given him no encouragement to prosecute this scheme. I told him I thought he might do better, as there was no engagement nor promise subsisting, that I did not know what designs my uncle might have formed for his advantage, but I was of opinion that he should not, at present, run the risk of disobliging him by any premature application of this nature. Honest Humphrey protested he would suffer death sooner than do or say anything that should give offence to the squire, but he owned he had a kindness for the young woman, and had reason to think she looked upon him with a favourable eye, that he considered this mutual manifestation of goodwill as an engagement, understood, which ought to be binding to the conscience of an honest man, and he hoped the squire and I would be of the same opinion, when we should be at leisure to bestow any thought about the matter. I believe he is in the right, and we shall find time to take his case into consideration. You see, we are fixed for some weeks at least, and as you have had a long respite, I hope you will begin immediately to discharge the arrears due to your affectionate J. Melford. October. To Miss Lydia Willis, at Gloucester. My dear Letty, never did I sit down to write in such agitation as I now feel. In the course of a few days, we have met with a number of incidents so wonderful and interesting, that all my ideas are thrown into confusion and perplexity. You must not expect either method or coherence in what I am going to relate, my dearest Willis. Since my last, the aspect of affairs is totally changed! And so changed. But I would fain give you a regular detail. In passing a river about 8 days ago, our coach was overturned, and some of us narrowly escaped with life. My uncle had well nigh perished. O heaven, I cannot reflect upon that circumstance without horror. I should have lost my best friend, my father and protector, but for the resolution and activity of his servant Humphry Clinker, whom Providence really seems to have placed near him for the necessity of this occasion. I would not be thought superstitious, but surely he acted from a stronger impulse than common fidelity. Was it not the voice of nature that loudly called upon him to save the life of his own father? For, Letty, it was discovered that Humphry Clinker was my uncle's natural son. Almost at the same instant, a gentleman, who came to offer us his assistance, and invite us to his house, turned out to be a very old friend of Mr. Bramble. His name is Mr. Denison, one of the worthiest men living, and his lady is a perfect saint upon earth. They have an only son. Who do you think is this only son? O Letty! O gracious heaven! How my heart palpitates, when I tell you that this only son of Mr. Denison's, is that very identical youth who, under the name of Wilson, has made such ravage in my heart! Yes, my dear friend. Wilson and I are now lodged in the same house, and converse together freely. His father approves of his sentiments in my favor, his mother loves me with all the tenderness of a parent, my uncle, my aunt and my brother no longer oppose my inclinations. On the contrary, they have agreed to make us happy without delay, and in 3 weeks or a month, if no unforeseen accident intervenes, your friend Lydia Melford will have changed her name and condition, I say, if no accident intervenes, because such a torrent of success makes me tremble! I wish there may not be something treacherous in this sudden reconciliation of fortune. I have no merit, I have no title, to such felicity. Far from enjoying the prospect that lies before me, my mind is harassed with a continued tumult, made up of hopes and wishes, doubts and apprehensions. I can neither eat nor sleep, and my spirits are in perpetual flutter. I more than ever feel that vacancy in my heart, which your presence alone can fill. The mind, in every disquiet, seeks to repose itself on the bosom of a friend, and this is such a trial as I really know not how to support without your company and counsel. I must, therefore, dear Letty, put your friendship to the test. I must beg you will come and do the last offices of maidenhood to your companion Lydia Melford. This letter goes enclosed in one to our worthy governess, from Mrs. Denison, entreating her to interpose with your mamma, that you may be allowed to favor us with your company on this occasion, and I flatter myself that no material objection can be made to our request. The distance from hence to Gloucester does not exceed 100 miles, and the roads are good. Mr. Clinker, alias Lloyd, shall be sent over to attend your motions. If you step into the post-chaise, with your maid Betty Barker, at 7 in the morning, you will arrive, by 4 in the afternoon at the halfway house, where there is good accommodation. There you shall be met by my brother and myself, who will next day conduct you to this place, where, I am sure, you will find yourself perfectly at your case in the midst of an agreeable society. Dear Letty, I will take no refusal. If you have any friendship, any humanity, you will come. I desire that immediate application may be made to your mamma, and that the moment her permission is obtained, you will apprise your ever faithful, Lydia Melford. October 4. To Mrs. German, at her house in Gloucester. Dear Madam, though I was not so fortunate as to be favoured with an answer to the letter with which I troubled you in the spring, I still flatter myself that you retain some regard for me and my concerns. I am sure the care and tenderness with which I was treated, under your roof and tuition, demand the warmest returns of gratitude and affection on my part, and these sentiments, I hope, I shall cherish to my dying day. At present, I think it my duty to make you acquainted with the happy issue of that indiscretion by which I incurred your displeasure. Madam, the slighted Wilson is metamorphosed into George Denison, only son and heir of a gentleman, whose character is second to none in England, as you may understand upon inquiry. My guardian, my brother and I, are now in his house, and an immediate union of the two families is to take place in the persons of the young gentleman and your poor Lydia Melford. You will easily conceive how embarrassing this situation must be to a young inexperienced creature like me, of weak nerves and strong apprehensions, and how much the presence of a friend and confidant would encourage and support me, on this occasion. You know, that of all the young ladies, Miss Willis was she that possessed the greatest share of my confidence and affection, and, therefore, I fervently wish to have the happiness of her company at this interesting crisis. Mrs. Denison, who is the object of universal love and esteem, has, at my request, written to you on this subject, and I now beg leave to reinforce her solicitations. My dear Mrs. German, my ever-honored governess, let me conjure you by that fondness which once distinguished your favorite Lydia, by that benevolence of heart, which disposes you to promote the happiness of your fellow creatures in general. Lend a favorable ear to my petition, and use your influence with Letty's mamma, that my most earnest desire may be gratified. Should I be indulged in this particular, I will engage to return her safe, and even to accompany her to Gloucester, where, if you will give me leave, I will present to you, under another name, dear Madam, your most affectionate humble servant, and penitent, Lydia Melford. October 14. To Mrs. Mary Jones, at Brambleton Hall. Oh Mary Jones! Mary Jones! I have met with so many accidents, surprisals, and terrifications, that I am in a pathetic fantigo, and I believe I shall never be my own self again. Last week I was dragged out of the river like a drowned rat, and lost a brand new nightcap, with a sulphur stay-hook, that cost me a good half-a-crown, and an odd shoe of green gallow monkey, besides wetting my clothes and tearing my smock, and an ugly gash made in the back part of my thigh, by the stump of a tree. To be sure, Mr. Clinker took me out of the cocks, but he left me on my back in the water, to go to the squire, and I might have had a watery grave, if a miller had not brought me to the dry land. But, oh! What choppings and changes, girl! The player man that came after Miss Liddy, and frightened me with a beard at Bristol Well, is now Matthew Murphy'd into a fine young gentleman, son and heir of Squire Dollison. We are all together in the same house, and all parties have agreed to the match, and in a fortnight the ceremony will be performed. But this is not the only wedding we are to have. Mistress is resolved to have the same frolic, in the name of God. Last Sunday in the parish crutch, if my own ears may be trusted, the clerk called the banes of marriage betwixt Hopania Lashmigo, and Tabitha Bramble, spinster. He might as well have called her inkle weaver, for she never spun an hank of yarn in her life. Young Squire Dollison and Miss Liddy make the second kipple, and there might have been a third, but times are changed with Mr. Clinker. Oh Molly! What dost think? Mr. Clinker is found to be a pie-blow of our own squire, and his right name is Mr. Matthew Lloyd. Though God he knows how that can be, and he is now out of livery, and wears ruffles, but I knew him when he was out at elbows, and had not a rag to cover his pistoleros, so he need not hold his head so high. He is for sartain very humble and complaisant, and protests as how he has the same regard as before, but that he is no longer his own master, and cannot portend to marry without the squire's consent. He says he must wait with patience, and trust to Providence, and such nonsense. But if so be as how his regard be the same, why stand shilly-shally? Why not strike while the iron is hot, and speak to the squire without loss of time? What subjection can the squire make to our coming together? My father want a gentleman, my mother was an honest woman, I didn't come on the wrong side of the blanket, girl. My parents were marred according to the right of Holy Mother Crutch, in the face of men and angles, mark that, Mary Jones. Mr. Clinker, Lloyd I would say, had best look to his tackle. There be other chaps in the market, as the saying is. What would he say if I should accept the soot and sarvice of the young squire's valley? Mr. McHappy is a gentleman born, and has been abroad in the wars. He has a world of book learning, and speaks French, and Ditch, and Scotch, and all manner of outlandish lingos. To be sure he's a little the worse for the wear, and is much given to drink, but then he's good-tempered in his liquor, and a prudent woman might wind him about her finger, but I have no thoughts of him. I'll assure you, I scorn for to do, or to say, or to think anything that might give unbreach to Mr. Lloyd, without further occasion. But then I have such vapours, Molly. I sit and cry by myself, and take ass of Atida, and smill to burnt fathers, and kindle snuffs, and I pray constantly for grease, that I may have a glimpse of the new light, to show me the way through this wretched vale of tares. And yet, I want for nothing in this family of love, where every soul is so kind and so courteous, that one would think they are so many saints in heaven. Dear Molly, I recommend myself to your prayers, being, with my sarvice to soul, your ever-loving, and discounselled friend, Win. Jenkins, October 4. To Dr. Lewis. Dear Dick, you cannot imagine what pleasure I have in seeing your handwriting, after such a long cessation on your side of our correspondence. Yet, heaven knows, I have often seen your handwriting with disgust. I mean, when it appeared in abbreviations of apothecaries' Latin. I like your hint of making interest for the reversion of the collector's place, for Mr. Lismahago, who is much pleased with the scheme, and presents you with his compliments and best thanks for thinking so kindly of his concerns. The man seems to mend, upon further acquaintance. That harsh reserve, which formed a disagreeable husk about his character, begins to peel off in the course of our communication. I have great hopes that he and Tabby will be as happily paired as any two draft animals in the kingdom, and I make no doubt but that he will prove a valuable acquisition to our little society, in the article of conversation, by the fireside in winter. Your objection to my passing this season of the year at such a distance from home, would have more weight if I did not find myself perfectly at my ease where I am, and my health so much improved, that I am disposed to bid defiance to gout and rheumatism. I begin to think I have put myself on the superannuated list too soon, and absurdly sought for health in the retreats of laziness. I am persuaded that all valetudinarians are too sedentary, too regular, and too cautious. We should sometimes increase the motion of the machine, to unclog the wheels of life, and now and then take a plunge amidst the waves of excess, in order to case-harden the constitution. I have even found a change of company as necessary as a change of air, to promote a vigorous circulation of the spirits, which is the very essence and criterion of good health. Since my last, I have been performing the duties of friendship, that required a great deal of exercise, from which I hope to derive some benefit, understanding, by the greatest accident in the world, that Mr. Baynard's wife was dangerously ill of a pleuritic fever. I borrowed Denison's post-chaise, and went across the country to his habitation, attended only by Lloyd, Quondam Clinker, on horseback. As the distance is not above 30 miles, I arrived about 4 in the afternoon, and meeting the physician at the door, was informed that his patient had just expired. I was instantly seized with a violent emotion, but it was not grief. The family being in confusion, I ran upstairs into the chamber, where, indeed, they were all assembled. The aunt stood wringing her hands in a kind of stupefaction of sorrow, but my friend acted all the extravagancies of affliction. He held the body in his arms, and poured forth such a lamentation, that one would have thought he had lost the most amiable consort and valuable companion upon earth. Affection may certainly exist independent of esteem, nay, the same object may be lovely in one respect, and detestable in another. The mind has a surprising faculty of accommodating, and even attaching itself, in such a manner, by dint of use, to things that are in their own nature disagreeable, and even pernicious, that it cannot bear to be delivered from them without reluctance and regret. Baynard was so absorbed in his delirium, that he did not perceive me when I entered, and desired one of the women to conduct the aunt into her own chamber. At the same time I begged the tutor to withdraw the boy, who stood gaping in a corner, very little affected with the distress of the scene. These steps being taken, I waited till the first violence of my friend's transport was abated, then disengaged him gently from the melancholy object, and led him by the hand into another apartment, though he struggled so hard, that I was obliged to have recourse to the assistance of his valet de chambre. In a few minutes, however, he recollected himself, and folding me in his arms, "This," cried he, "is a friendly office, indeed!" I know not how you came hither, but, I think, Heaven sent you to prevent my going distracted. Oh Matthew! I have lost my dear Harriet! My poor, gentle, tender creature, that loved me with such warmth and purity of affection, my constant companion of 20 years. She's gone for ever! Heaven and earth! Where is she? Death shall not part us. So saying, he started up, and could hardly be withheld from returning to the scene we had quitted. You will perceive it would have been very absurd for me to argue with a man that talked so madly. On all such occasions, the first torrent of passion must be allowed to subside gradually. I endeavored to beguile his attention by starting little hints and insinuating other objects of discourse imperceptibly, and being exceedingly pleased in my own mind at this event, I exerted myself with such an extraordinary flow of spirits as was attended with success. In a few hours, he was calm enough to hear reason, and even to own that Heaven could not have interposed more effectually to rescue him from disgrace and ruin. That he might not, however, relapse into weaknesses for want of company, I passed the night in his chamber, in a little tent bed brought thither on purpose, and well it was I took this precaution, for he started up in bed several times, and would have played the fool, if I had not been present. Next day he was in a condition to talk of business, and vested me with full authority over his household, which I began to exercise without loss of time, though not before he knew and approved of the scheme I had projected for his advantage. He would have quitted the house immediately, but this retreat I opposed. Far from encouraging a temporary disgust, which might degenerate into an habitual aversion, I resolved, if possible, to attach him more than ever to his household gods. I gave directions for the funeral to be as private as was consistent with decency. I wrote to London, that an inventory and estimate might be made of the furniture and effects in his town house, and gave notice to the landlord, that Mr. Baynard should quit the premises at Lady Day. I set a person at work to take account of everything in the country house, including horses, carriages, and harness. I settled the young gentleman at a boarding school, kept by a clergyman in the neighborhood, and thither he went without reluctance, as soon as he knew that he was to be troubled no more with his tutor, whom we dismissed. The aunt continued very sullen, and never appeared at table, though Mr. Baynard paid his respects to her every day in her own chamber. There also she held conferences with the waiting women and other servants of the family, but, the moment her niece was interred, she went away in a post-chaise prepared for that purpose. She did not leave the house, however, without giving Mr. Baynard to understand that the wardrobe of her niece was the perquisite of her woman. Accordingly that worthless drab received all the clothes, laces, and linen of her deceased mistress, to the value of £500, at a moderate computation. The next step I took was to disband that legion of supernumerary domestics, who had preyed so long upon the vitals of my friend, a parcel of idle drones, so intolerably insolent, that they even treated their own master with the most contemptuous neglect. They had been generally hired by his wife, according to the recommendation of her woman, and these were the only patrons to whom they paid the least deference. I had therefore uncommon satisfaction in clearing the house of these vermin. The woman of the deceased, and a chambermaid, a valet de chambre, a butler, a French cook, a master gardener, 2 footmen and a coachman, I paid off, and turned out of the house immediately, paying to each a month's wages in lieu of warning. Those whom I retained, consisted of the female cook, who had been assistant to the Frenchman, a housemaid, an old lackey, a postilion, and under gardener. Thus I removed at once a huge mountain of expense and care from the shoulders of my friend, who could hardly believe the evidence of his own senses, when he found himself so suddenly and so effectually relieved. His heart, however, was still subject to vibrations of tenderness, which returned at certain intervals, extorting sighs, and tears, and exclamations of grief and impatience, but these fits grew every day, less violent and less frequent, till at length his reason obtained a complete victory over the infirmities of his nature. Upon an accurate inquiry into the state of his affairs, I find his debts amount to £20,000, for £18,000 of which sum his estate is mortgaged, and as he pays 5% interest, and some of his farms are unoccupied, he does not receive above £200 a year clear from his lands, over and above the interest of his wife's fortune, which produced £800 annually. For lightening this heavy burthen, I devised the following expedient. His wife's jewels, together with his superfluous plate and furniture in both houses, his horses and carriages, which are already advertised to be sold by auction, will, according to the estimate, produce £2,500 in ready money, with which the debt will be immediately reduced to £18,000. I have undertaken to find him £10,000 at 4%, by which means he will save 100 a year in the article of interest, and perhaps we shall be able to borrow the other 8,000 on the same terms. According to his own scheme of a country life, he says he can live comfortably for £300 a year, but, as he has a son to educate, we will allow him 500, then there will be an accumulating fund of 700 a year, principal and interest, to pay off the encumbrance, and, I think, we may modestly add 300, on the presumption of new leasing and improving the vacant farms, so that, In a couple of years, I suppose there will be above 1,000 a year appropriated to liquidate a debt of 16,000. We forthwith began to class and set apart the articles designed for sale, under the direction of an upholder from London, and, that nobody in the house might be idle, commenced our reformation without doors, as well as within. With Baynard's good leave, I ordered the gardener to turn the rivulet into its old channel, to refresh the fainting naiads, who had so long languished among mouldering roots, withered leaves, and dry pebbles. The shrubbery is condemned to extirpation, and the pleasure ground will be restored to its original use of cornfield and pasture. Orders are given for rebuilding the walls of the garden at the back of the house, and for planting clumps of firs, intermingled with beech and chestnut, at the east end, which is now quite exposed to the surly blasts that come from that quarter. All these works being actually begun, and the house and auction left to the care and management of a reputable attorney, I brought Baynard along with me in the chaise, and made him acquainted with Denison, whose goodness of heart would not fail to engage his esteem and affection. He is indeed charmed with our society in general, and declares that he never saw the theory of true pleasure reduced to practice before. I really believe it would not be an easy task to find such a number of individuals assembled under one roof, more happy than we are at present. I must tell you, however, in confidence, I suspect Abby of tergiversation.I have been so long accustomed to that original, that I know all the caprices of her heart, and can often perceive her designs while they are yet in embryo. She attached herself to Lismahago for no other reason but that she despaired of making a more agreeable conquest. At present, if I am not much mistaken in my observation, she would gladly convert the widowhood of Baynard to her own advantage. Since he arrived, she has behaved very coldly to the captain, and strove to fasten on the other's heart, with the hooks of overstrained civility. These must be the instinctive efforts of her constitution, rather than the effects of any deliberate design, for matters are carried to such a length with the lieutenant, that she could not retract with any regard to conscience or reputation. Besides, she will meet with nothing but indifference or aversion on the side of Baynard, who has too much sense to think of such a partner at any time, and too much delicacy to admit a thought of any such connection at the present juncture. Meanwhile, I have prevailed upon her to let him have £4,000 at 4% towards paying off his mortgage. Young Denison has agreed that Liddy's fortune shall be appropriated to the same purpose, on the same terms. His father will sell out £3,000 stock for his accommodation. Farmer Bland has, at the desire of Wilson, undertaken for 2,000, and I must make an effort to advance what further will be required to take my friend out of the hands of the Philistines. He is so pleased with the improvements made on his estate, which is all cultivated like a garden, that he has entered himself as a pupil in farming to Mr. Denison, and resolved to attach himself wholly to the practice of husbandry. Everything is now prepared for our double wedding. The marriage articles for both couples are drawn and executed, and the ceremony only waits until the parties shall have been resident in the parish the term prescribed by law. Young Denison betrays some symptoms of impatience, but Lismahago bears this necessary delay with the temper of a philosopher. You must know, the captain does not stand altogether on the foundation of personal merit. Besides his half-pay, amounting to £42 a year, this indefatigable economist has amassed £800, which he has secured in the funds. This sum arises, partly from his pays running up while he remained among the Indians, partly from what he received as a consideration for the difference between his full appointment and the hay pay, to which he is now restricted, and partly from the profits of a little traffic he drove in peltry, during his sachamship among the Miamis. Liddy's fears and perplexities have been much assuaged by the company of one, Miss Willis, who had been her intimate companion at the boarding school. Her parents had been earnestly solicited to allow her making this friendly visit on such an extraordinary occasion, and 2 days ago she arrived with her mother, who did not choose that she should come without a proper gouvernante. The young lady is very sprightly, handsome, and agreeable, and the mother a mighty good sort of a woman, so that their coming adds considerably to our enjoyment. But we shall have a third couple yoked in the matrimonial chain. Mr. Clinker Lloyd has made humble remonstrance through the canal of my nephew, setting forth the sincere love and affection mutually subsisting between him and Mrs. Winifred Jenkins, and praying my consent to their coming together for life. I would have wished that Mr. Clinker had kept out of this scrape, but as the nymph's happiness is at stake, and she has already some fits in the way of despondence, I, in order to prevent any tragical catastrophe, have given him leave to play the fool, in imitation of his betters, and I suppose we shall in time have a whole litter of his progeny at Brambleton Hall. The fellow is stout and lusty, very sober and conscientious, and the wench seems to be as great an enthusiast in love as in religion. I wish you would think of employing him some other way, that the parish may not be overstocked. You know he has been bred a farrier, consequently belongs to the faculty, and as he is very docile, I make no doubt but, with your good instruction, he may be, in a little time, qualified to act as a Welsh apothecary. Tabby, who never did a favour with a good grace, has consented, with great reluctance, to this match. Perhaps it hurts her pride, as she now considers Clinker in the light of a relation, but, I believe, her objections are of a more selfish nature. She declares she cannot think of retaining the wife of Matthew Lloyd in the character of a servant, and she foresees, that on such an occasion the woman will expect some gratification for her past services. As for Clinker, exclusive of other considerations, he is so trusty, brave, affectionate, and alert, and I owe him such personal obligations, that he merits more than all the indulgence that can possibly be shown him, by yours, Matt. To Sir Watkin Phillips, Bart. At Oxon. Dear Knight, the fatal knots are now tied. The comedy is near a close, and the curtain is ready to drop, but, the latter scenes of this Act 1 shall recapitulate in order. About a fortnight ago, my uncle made an excursion across the country, and brought hither a particular friend, one Mr. Baynard, who has just lost his wife, and was for some time disconsolate, though by all accounts he had much more cause for joy than for sorrow at this event. His countenance, however, clears up apace, and he appears to be a person of rare accomplishments. But, we have received another still more agreeable reinforcement to our company, by the arrival of Miss Willis from Gloucester. She was Liddy's bosom friend at the boarding school, and being earnestly solicited to assist at the nuptials, her mother was so obliging as to grant my sister's request, and even to come with her in person. Liddy, accompanied by George Dennison and me, gave them the meeting halfway, and next day conducted them hither in safety. Miss Willis is a charming girl, and, in point of disposition, an agreeable contrast to my sister, who is rather too grave and sentimental for my turn of mind. The other is gay, frank, a little giddy, and always good-humored. She has, moreover, a genteel fortune, is well-born, and remarkably handsome. Ah, Phillips! If these qualities were permanent, if her humor would never change, nor her beauties decay, what efforts would I not make? But these are idle reflections. My destiny must one day be fulfilled. At present we pass the time as agreeably as we can. We have got up several farces, which afforded unspeakable entertainment by the effects they produced among the country people, who are admitted to all our exhibitions. 2 nights ago, Jack Wilson acquired great applause in Harlequin Skeleton, and Lismahago surprised us all in the character of Pierrot. His long lank sides, and strong marked features, were all peculiarly adapted to his part. He appeared with a ludicrous stare, from which he had discharged all meaning. He adopted the impressions of fear and amazement so naturally, that many of the audience were infected by his looks, but when the skeleton held him in chase his horror became most divertingly picturesque, and seemed to endow him with such preternatural agility as confounded all the spectators. It was a lively representation of death in pursuit of consumption, and had such an effect upon the commonalty, that some of them shrieked aloud, and others ran out of the hall in the utmost consternation. This is not the only instance in which the lieutenant has lately excited our wonder. His temper, which had been soured and shriveled by disappointment and chagrin, is now swelled out, and smoothed like a raisin, in plumperage. From being reserved and punctilious, he has become easy and obliging. He cracks jokes, laughs and banters, with the most facetious familiarity, and, in a word, enters into all our schemes of merriment and pastime. The other day his baggage arrived in the wagon from London, contained in 2 large trunks and a long deal box not unlike a coffin. The trunks were filled with his wardrobe, which he displayed for the entertainment of the company, and he freely owned that it consisted chiefly of the opium spolia taken in battle. What he selected for his wedding suit was a tarnished white cloth faced with blue velvet, embroidered with silver, but he valued himself most upon a tight periwig, in which he had made his first appearance as a lawyer above 30 years ago. This machine had been in buckle ever since, and now all the servants in the family were employed to frizz it out for the occasion, which was yesterday celebrated at the parish church. George Denison and his bride were distinguished by nothing extraordinary in their apparel. His eyes lightened with eagerness and joy, and she trembled with coyness and confusion. My uncle gave her away, and her friend, Willis, supported her during the ceremony. But my aunt and her paramour took the pas, and formed, indeed, such a pair of originals, as, I believe, all England could not parallel. She was dressed in the style of 1739, and the day being cold, put on a mantille of green velvet laced with gold, but this was taken off by the bridegroom, who threw over her shoulders a fur cloak of American sables, valued, at 80 guineas, a present equally agreeable and unexpected. Thus accoutred, she was led up to the altar by Mr. Denison, who did the office of her father. Lismahago advanced in the military step with his French coat reaching no farther than the middle of his thigh, his campaign wig that surpasses all description, and a languishing leer upon his countenance, in which there seemed to be something arch and ironical. The ring, which he put upon her finger, he had concealed till the moment it was used. He now produced it with an air of self-complacency. It was a curious antique, set with rose diamonds. He told us afterwards, it had been in the family 200 years and was a present from his grandmother. These circumstances agreeably flattered the pride of our Aunt Tabitha, which had already found uncommon gratification in the captain's generosity, for he had, in the morning, presented my uncle with a fine bear's skin, and a Spanish fowling piece, and me with a case of pistols curiously mounted with silver. At the same time he gave Mrs. Jenkins an Indian purse, made of silk grass, containing 20 crown pieces. You must know, this young lady, with the assistance of Mr. Lloyd, formed the third couple who yesterday sacrificed to Hymen. I wrote to you in my last, that he had recourse to my mediation, which I employed successfully with my uncle, but Mrs. Tabitha held out till the lovesick Jenkins had 2 fits of the mother, then she relented, and those 2 cooing turtles were caged for life. Our aunt made an effort of generosity in furnishing the bride with her superfluities of clothes and linen, and her example was followed by my sister, nor did Mr. Bramble and I neglect her on this occasion. It was, indeed, a day of peace offering. Mr. Denison insisted upon Liddy's accepting 2 bank notes of £100 each, as pocket money, and his lady gave her a diamond necklace of double that value. There was, besides, a mutual exchange of tokens among the individuals of the 2 families thus happily united. As George Denison and his partner were judged improper objects of mirth, Jack Wilson had resolved to execute some jokes on Lismahago, and after supper began to ply him with bumpers, when the ladies had retired, but the captain, perceiving his drift, begged for quarter, alleging that the adventure, in which he had engaged, was a very serious matter, and that it would be more the part of a good Christian to pray that he might be strengthened, than to impede his endeavors to finish the adventure. He was spared accordingly, and permitted to ascend the nuptial couch with all his senses about him. There he and his consort sat in state, like Saturn and Cybele, while the benediction posset was drank, and a cake being broken over the head of Mrs. Tabitha Lismahago, the fragments were distributed among the bystanders, according to the custom of the ancient Britons, on the supposition that every person who eat of this hallowed cake, should that night have a vision of the man or woman whom heaven designed should be his or her wedded mate. The weight of Wilson's waggery fell upon honest Humphrey and his spouse, who were bedded in an upper room, with the usual ceremony of throwing the stocking. This being performed, and the company withdrawn, a sort of caterwauling ensued, when Jack found means to introduce a real cat shod with walnut shells, which galloping along the boards, made such a dreadful noise as effectually discomposed our lovers. Winifred screamed aloud, and shrunk under the bedclothes. Mr. Lloyd, believing that Satan was come to buffet him in propria persona, laid aside all carnal thoughts, and began to pray aloud with great fervency. At length, the poor animal, being more afraid than either, leaped into the bed, and mulled with the most piteous exclamation. Lloyd, thus informed of the nature of the annoyance, rose and set the door wide open, so that this troublesome visitant retreated with great expedition. Then, securing himself, by means of a double bolt, from a second intrusion, he was left to enjoy his good fortune without further disturbance. If one may judge from the looks of the parties, they are all very well satisfied with what has passed. George Denison and his wife are too delicate to exhibit any strong marked signs of their mutual satisfaction, but their eyes are sufficiently expressive. Mrs. Tabitha Lismahago is rather fulsome in signifying her approbation of the captain's love, while his deportment is the very pink of gallantry. He sighs, and ogles, and languishes at this amiable object. He kisses her hand, mutters ejaculations of rapture, and sings tender airs, and, no doubt, laughs internally at her folly in believing him sincere. In order to show how little his vigor was impaired by the fatigues of the preceding day, he this morning danced a Highland saraband over a naked backsword, and leaped so high, that I believe he would make no contemptible figure as a vaulter at Sadler's Wells. Mr. Matthew Lloyd, when asked how he relished his bargain, throws up his eyes, crying, "For what we have received, Lord make us thankful, Amen." His helpmate giggles, and holds her hand before her eyes, affecting to be ashamed of having been in bed with a man. Thus all these Widgeons enjoy the novelty of their situation, but, perhaps their notes will be changed, when they are better acquainted with the nature of the decoy. As Mrs. Willis cannot be persuaded to stay, and Liddy is engaged by promise to accompany her daughter back to Gloucester, I fancy there will be a general migration from hence, and that most of us will spend the Christmas holidays at Bath, in which case, I shall certainly find an opportunity to beat up your quarters. By this time, I suppose, you are sick of alma mater, and even ready to execute that scheme of peregrination, which was last year concerted between you and your affectionate J. Melford. To Dr. Lewis. Dear Doctor, my niece Liddy is now happily settled for life, and Captain Lismahago has taken Tabby off my hands, so that I have nothing further to do, but to comfort my friend Baynard, and provide for my son Lloyd, who is also fairly joined to Mrs. Winifred Jenkins. You are an excellent genius at hints. Dr. Arbuthnot was but a type of Dr. Lewis in that respect. What you observe of the vestry clerk deserves consideration. I make no doubt but Matthew Lloyd is well enough qualified for the office, but, at present, you must find room for him in the house. His incorruptible honesty and indefatigable care will be serviceable in superintending the economy of my farm, though I don't mean that he shall interfere with Barnes, of whom I have no cause to complain. I am just returned with Baynard from a second trip to his house, where everything is regulated to his satisfaction. He could not, however, review the apartments without tears and lamentation, so that he is not yet in a condition to be left alone. Therefore I will not part with him till the spring, when he intends to plunge into the avocations of husbandry, which will at once employ and amuse his attention. Charles Denison has promised to stay with him a fortnight, to set him fairly afloat in his improvements, and Jack Wilson will see him from time to time. Besides, he has a few friends in the country, whom his new plan of life will not exclude from his society. In less than a year, I make no doubt, but he will find himself perfectly at ease both in his mind and body, for the one had dangerously affected the other, and I shall enjoy the exquisite pleasure of seeing my friend rescued from misery and contempt. Mrs. Willis being determined to return with her daughter, in a few days, to Gloucester, our plan has undergone some alteration. Jery has persuaded his brother-in-law to carry his wife to Bath, and I believe his parents will accompany him thither. For my part, I have no intention to take that route. It must be something very extraordinary that will induce me to revisit either Bath or London. My sister and her husband, Baynard, and I will take leave of them at Gloucester, and make the best of our way to Brambleton Hall, where I desire you will prepare a good chine and turkey for our Christmas dinner. You must also employ your medical skill in defending me from the attacks of the gout, that I may be in good case to receive the rest of our company, who promise to visit us in their return from the Bath. As I have laid in a considerable stock of health, it is to be hoped you will not have much trouble with me in the way of physic, but I intend to work you on the side of exercise. I have got an excellent fowling piece from Mr. Lismahago, who is a keen sportsman, and we shall take the heath in all weathers. That this scheme of life may be prosecuted the more effectually, I intend to renounce all sedentary amusements, particularly that of writing long letters, a resolution, which, had I taken it sooner, might have saved you the trouble which you have lately taken in reading the tedious epistles of Matt. Bramble, November 20. To Mrs. Gwylym, at Brambleton Hall. Good Mrs. Gwylym, Heaven, for wise purposes, hath ordained that I should change my name and citation in life, so that I am not to be considered any more as manager of my brother's family, but as I cannot surrender up my stewardship till I have settled with you and Williams, I desire you will get your accounts ready for inspection, as we are coming home without further delay. My spouse, the captain, being subject to rheumatics, I beg you will take great care to have the blue chamber, up 2 pair of stairs, well warmed for his reception. Let the sashes be secured, the crevices stopped, the carpets laid, and the beds well towseled. Mrs. Lady Jenkins, being married to a relation of the family, cannot remain in the capacity of a servant, therefore, I wish you would cast about for some creditable body to be with me in her room, if she can spin, and is mistress of plain work, so much the better, but she must not expect extravagant wages. Having a family of my own, I must be more ecumenical than ever. No more at present, but rest your loving friend, Tab. Lismahago, November 20. To Mrs. Mary Jones, at Brambleton Hall. Mrs. Jones, Providence hath been pleased to make great alteration in the pasture of our affairs. We were yesterday 3 kipple chened, by the grace of God, in the holy bands of matrimony, and I now subscribe myself Lloyd at your service. All the parish allowed that young Squire Dillison and his bride was a comely pair for to see. As for Madame Lashnaego, you knows her peculiarities, her head, to be sure, was fantastical, and her spouse had wrapped her with a long Moroccan furs cloak from the land of the Selvages, though they say it is of immense value. The captain himself had a huge hassock of air, with 3 tails, and a tawdry coat, bordered with sulphur. Wan said he was a monkey bank, and the old bottler swore he was the Bornimikov, to title. For my part, I says nothing, being as how the captain has done the handsome thing by me. Mr. Lloyd was dressed in a light frog, and checket with gold binding, and though he don't enter in comparison with great folks of quality, yet he has got as good blood in his veins as arrow private squire in the county, and then his pursing is far from contemptible. Your humble servant had on a plain, pea green tabby sack, with my runnel cap, rough to pay, and side curls. They said, I was the very moral of Lady Rick Manstone, but not so pale, that may well be, for her ladyship is my elder by 7 good years and more. Now, Mrs. Mary, our satiety is to suppurate Mr. Milford goes to Bath along with the Dillisons, and the rest of us push home to Wales, to pass our Christmas at Brambleton Hall, as our apartments is to be the Yellow Pepper, in the 3rd story. Pray carry my things thither, present my compliments to Mrs. Gwylym, and I hope she and I will live upon decent terms of civility. Being, by God's blessing, removed to a higher sphere, you'll excuse my being familiar with the lower servants of the family, but, as I trust you'll behave respectful, and keep a proper distance, you may always depend upon the goodwill and protection of yours, W. Lloyd. November 20th. Finis.